austerity means self-denial. When applied to government, it usually means cutting spending. But I put the word in quotes here because despite the media wailing about austerity, there have been few real cuts here or in Europe. Now, the left hates austerity. There are books out like Austerity Kills. Paul Krugman calls people like me who support cutting government spending Austerians. He says this comic strip explains it all. It portrays Austerians as aliens who want to destroy Earth. Krugman's the hero, of course, for saying austerity is madness. The aliens then shoot him for revealing this truth.
Well, I'm proud to be an Austerian, even if Krugman and, frankly, most of my neighbors in Manhattan
Think I'm from outer space. Unfortunately, only a few people in Congress actually take my side and want to cut spending. I'm happy to have one of them here with us tonight. Senator Rand Paul has proposed specific cuts. But, Senator, I'm told if we cut now when the economy isn't great, this will make unemployment worse.
Well, here's the amazing thing about people saying that we are living in an age of austerity. We have not cut any spending in Washington. Even the sequester is a cut in the rate of growth. Spending still is growing in Washington. But when they say, oh, if you cut spending, that will somehow cause lack of economic growth. Well, people spend money. It's just who spends it. And Friedman had this, and he put it really well when he said, nobody spends someone else's money as wisely as they spend their own.
And when you talk to your colleagues about there have been no real cuts, do they look at you like you're wrong?
No, I think a lot of people up here actually understand it. People like Krugman take it and they demagogue an issue that they know full well that we aren't really cutting spending around here, that we're slowing the rate of growth at best. But even the rate of growth, you saw how they went crazy and said, oh, the sequester, the sky is falling, the world will end. Well, guess what? The same week they do that, they send an extra $250 million to Egypt. So they've got plenty of money to send around the world, and yet they say, oh, we don't have enough money for White House tours. It just doesn't pass the smell test.
Now, you have a real plan that would actually cut. You would eliminate 4 cabinet departments: commerce, education, energy, housing and urban development. When you say that to people, that frightens them, I assume.
Well, what I tell people is that really what is extreme is what's going on up here. Balancing your budget. If you talk to any family about balancing their budget, not spending more than comes in, it sounds like a very reasonable notion. There's the seen versus the unseen. I can take money from the economy and I can build a bright, shiny building and say, oh, well, this is what I did with your money. But what we don't see is what entrepreneurs and individuals would have done with that extra money in the economy, which goes back to what Friedman said. Who spends money more wisely, when it's your own or when it's government? I think government are profligate wasters of money, and they have no clue as to how to make anything. So I want to leave more money in the productive economy and less money in Washington.
The private sector might have spent the money for the shiny building, creating thousands of jobs or curing cancer. We don't know what they might have done.
Right? But really, it's who can make things better, the private world or the government. And I think we have a great deal of evidence that the government wastes money, misdirects it. I mean, I can give you example after example of millions of dollars spent on roll-up beef jerky, $5 million spent on studying the collective action of fish. There's been no austerity here in the United States. We have struggled to slow down the rate of growth of government, and they fought us tooth and nail on the sequester, which just slows the rate of growth. But I think the American people aren't buying it. And I think they see that there's been a little bit of a gamesmanship and a playing by the president to say, oh, no more self-guided White House tours, no more inspection of the meat, no more air traffic controllers, when in reality, I think most people believe that you could move money around in a $3.8 trillion government and cover some of these things. I'll give you just one example how, if the president would have behaved rationally, if you just don't rehire the people who are retiring from government, that's $6 billion a year. So the sequester was passed a year and a half ago. He did nothing. For a year and a half, if he'd have instituted that, that would have been $9 billion. That's nearly a fourth of what we needed to cut.
Thank you, Senator Paul. Now, although America has big financial problems, in Europe, things are worse. This riot was in Greece. Greece has had the most riots, but there have been big fights in Spain, Portugal, England. The protesters blame austerity.
It's just a terrible situation, only cuts, cuts, cuts.
Cuts, cuts, cuts. Yes, it must be terrible there. All this budget slashing is unethical experimentation on human beings, says Paul Krugman. He and many others say Europe's troubles prove the free market argument is wrong. And I admit the Europe struggles gave me pause. I see stories about Europe with headlines like "The economic argument is over, Paul Krugman is won." Could it be true? Cato economist Dan Mitchell has studied European austerity. Why haven't the budget cuts worked?
Because there haven't been any. That woman from England who you just quoted, government spending has gone up in the United Kingdom every single year for at least a couple of decades, and even since the so-called Conservative Party government took over a couple of years ago. Not only that, it's rising faster than inflation. You look at France, government spending's been going up.
We have a graph of some of these countries: France, Italy, United Kingdom, Spain.
All these countries were increasing government spending at a rapid rate. And then all of a sudden, the fiscal financial crisis hit. Oh, we have to do something. We have to do austerity. But what they meant by austerity wasn't let's prune back the size of this bloated public sector. They said let's raise taxes. So all these countries were raising taxes, driving their private sectors into the dirt with these punitive class warfare tax hikes. That didn't work. And so now, finally, as you said, in Greece, we're seeing a tiny bit of spending cuts only because they've reached the end of the rope. They can't get more bailouts. They still can't borrow from the private sector. They've raised taxes to the point where even the IMF said there are Laffer curve responses. You'll get less revenue. So amazingly, it's like, hallelujah, the Greeks have finally, when they tried everything else and it failed, they made a tiny, tiny spending cut.
But why all this publicity about draconian cuts? And people there experiencing it believe it.
Here's the problem. The fight in Europe is between the so-called austerity crowd and the growth crowd. But the growth crowd are really the Paul Krugman, Keynesian big spender types who think government spending is some sort of magic elixir that you throw it onto the economy, it grows. And the austerity people, well, the IMF and whatnot, they just want higher taxes. There's nobody in Europe who's actually advancing the position that Senator Rand Paul was talking about and some others are talking about in the U.S. of we have a big, expensive, inefficient government. If we want more growth, we need to shrink the burden of government spending. And it doesn't matter whether you finance government with taxes or borrowing. It's the transfer of resources from the private sector to the government. That's what hurts your economy.
Because government has no money of its own. It has to take it from the private economy.
Yes, and in all likelihood, they're not going to spend the money as efficiently.
And the coverage is so insane. The Atlantic, that's a respectable magazine. My nephew's the editor. And yet, Atlantic editor Matthew O'Brien, that's not my nephew, someone else, the more a country has cut, the more unemployment it has. A recovery is worth a deficit.
I bet he probably also agrees with Paul Krugman and somehow thinks that more government spending will help an economy, even though it didn't work for Hoover and Roosevelt in the 30s, it didn't work for Japan in the 90s, didn't work for Bush in 2008, didn't work for Obama in 2009. It's never worked anywhere.
But people believe.
Politicians love the theory because it tells them that their vice is a virtue.
Oh, and they like to spend.
Oh, you're telling me that it's good for the economy if I go out and give money to all these interest groups that are helping my campaign? Oh, yeah, I'm with you. I'll be first in line.
Any good examples? Any country that's done it right?
I just got back from Europe, got off the plane today, came here because this show is the best place to be.
Definitely.
The Baltic countries, most people don't even know where they are. Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, they've actually done the right thing. When the fiscal financial crisis hit in 2008, they actually cut government spending. And when I say cut government spending, I'm not talking about the Washington thing. Oh, we increased spending at 6% instead of 8%, so that's a 2% cut. No, in the Baltic countries, spending was actually lower in 2009 than it was in 2008, then it was lower again in 2010 than it was in 2009.
And those economies are growing.
Those economies are growing. They've recovered. Jobs are coming back. They have positive GDP. In other words, economic growth, while the countries that have gone with the tax increase approach, like Italy, Spain, Greece, Portugal, et cetera, they're in a recession. In other words, the moral of the story is you have to figure out ways to reduce the burden of government spending and taxes, and most countries in Europe haven't done that. The Baltics are a tiny glimmer of good news.
And back on this continent, just one last example. Years back in the 90s, Canada made big cuts, real cuts, and prospered. The Canadian dollar was worth 70-some cents at the time. Now it's has parity with our dollar. It works.
It's amazing, and most of those spending cuts and actual, genuine, real spending cuts in Canada happened under a Labour Party government.
A liberal government, because only the liberals can get this stuff through.
New Zealand did the same thing in the 1990s. And when these countries, and actually, to be fair, Bill Clinton was much better than a lot of Republicans. At least he restrained the growth of spending. Of course, Republicans in Congress played a big role in that, too.
Made him do it.
But the good news is, the evidence shows if you at least restrain the growth of government, or even better, actually cut government spending, you're freeing up resources for the productive sector of the economy, and that's where you get growth. We have to focus on taking government, which is this big giant blob now, and somehow figuring out how to at least restrict it so that it's growing slower than the private sector.